Let's take our Bibles, Esther chapter 4. Working our way through. It is lesson 4 in Esther 4. And I think this is like one of the first, actually working through a book where we're able to line up the lessons with the chapters. Brother Rick, it's just, eventually we end up with, I don't know, like 10 lessons more than there are chapters is how it works. And sometimes how it works. I think we kept okay with Jeremiah, if I remember. We kept on track there because it was a long book, so you had to stay on track with Jeremiah. Esther chapter 4, and let's pick up reading in verse number 1. Let's just read through the chapter, and we'll go back and talk about it. Esther 4, and picking up in verse 1, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went into the midst of the city, and cried with a loud and a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate. For none might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved. And she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai, and to take away his sackcloth from him. But he received it not. Then called Esther for Hatach, one of the king's chamberlains, one whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. So Hatach went forth to Mordecai unto the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. Also he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king and make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. And Hatach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again Esther spake unto Hatach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his, to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come unto the king these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. And I and my maidens will fast likewise. So will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way, and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Father, help me now as I teach your word for this moment in time. Would it stir our hearts, reminding us that you are on the throne and that you are our help in time of trouble. I pray, Lord, that the message would help set our priorities as we prepare as a congregation to come before your presence in prayer. Lord, truly that is the highlight of Wednesday nights, is this corporate prayer meeting. And we ask that you would work in our hearts, preparing us for that. We ask these things in your name, thy name that is above every name, the name of Jesus. Amen. Last week in our study through the book of Esther, we saw the bad guy, Haman. He set his sinister plan in motion. He curled his handlebar mustache like Dastardly McNasty. And I mean, he was ready to go. He took his personal grudge against Mordecai and elevated it into a plot to utterly destroy all of his people. We saw that Haman was a descendant of Agag, the king of the Amorites, whom King Saul had been instructed to destroy, but had not. We saw that Esther and Mordecai were the tribe of Benjamin. It was the same rivalry all these hundreds of years later between Agag and Saul's lineage. Only now the Jews were in big trouble. The king's commandment had gone out. Now we got to understand something about the signed commandments of the king, and this is going to play out later when we look at it. When the Persian Empire, the kings of the Persian Empire would sign a decree and seal it with a royal seal, no one, not even the king, could change the law. It's, if you remember in Daniel, when Nebuchadnezzar came to power, he was in his own vision that he received from the Lord, this head of gold, that whatever Nebuchadnezzar said, it went. If he wanted you living, you'd be living. If he wanted you dead, you'd be dead. If he said, kill you, change your mind, and keep you alive, that's how it would work. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian kings, absolute rule. The Persian kings, lesser empire in power, in Daniel's prophecies and what the Word of God tells us there, when they set a law, if you remember Daniel in the lion's den, the king could not change it. So this decree that's sent out, as far as Haman is concerned, it's a done deal. And really, for the Jews, that is a serious concern as well, because the king's royal seal has signed the edict. The judgment has been passed. The die has been cast against the Jews. They are as good as dead. We got to understand really how these things would have appeared to the Jews hearing about this commandment. And Mordecai, no doubt, would have been one of the first to hear of it. I think I almost wonder if Haman would have hand-delivered it to him. And so his response, it is one that realizes he is a walking dead man. He and all of his people. So let's see how things fare now. The plot has been set in motion for the story. It's thickening. What are our heroes going to do? Well, we see number one, Mordecai's deep sorrow. Mordecai's response to what he has heard is anguish of heart. He does something that in our culture seems very strange, but in this culture, it was a commonplace practice. We find it throughout the Old Testament, this idea of putting on sackcloth and ashes. Now, what is sackcloth? Sackcloth would have been very rough, very uncomfortable, very cheap garment. When I did some studying, the commentaries I pulled up, they said it would be a goat hair garment, very, very uncomfortable. You know, we think of the idea like a burlap, something rough, something that's just, you wouldn't want to walk around in it. Not something you want to wear. But then, not only did they wear this stuff here, they would rend their clothes, they'd tear their clothes, and again, in these days, culture is different. For us, you go to Walmart and buy a shirt for $15 or something like that. In those days, a garment that was worth money. That was some serious cash to put out to own a full garment. They rent their clothing. It was a sign of their emotion. They're yielding. They're destroying their property, their wealth, because they were so vexed, so deeply hurt, so deeply sorrowful. Then they would sit down and they'd take ashes. And they'd pour it upon their heads, make themselves dirty and gray and really kind of a shameful thing to look at. And that was the idea. It was this humility, this recognition of shame. And they would take, it was a way of taking what they felt on the inside and expressing it for all to see on the outside. We'd find this practice throughout the Old Testament. Sometimes it would be for a personal sorrow. I think of Job. There's an example of personal sorrow. He lost all that he had. Or we could think of, as in this case, national crisis. The whole people, the whole Jewish world is in danger of destruction. As we look at the story, we have to pause for a moment and try to put ourselves in Mordecai's mind, his position. What do you think would have gone through his mind? Maybe some fear, certainly. Anger. Bitterness. Shock. Maybe he asked the question, where's God in all this? Have you ever been there? Where is God in all of this? You look at a tragedy, and we've seen some national tragedies. There was this shooting in Chicago on the 4th. Talk about tragedy. And sometimes we have to step back and we look at the evil in our world, and we look at sometimes personal loss and personal sorrows, and say, where is God in my circumstance? Where is God in our nation? Where is God in our world? You ever been there? If we can just be real, I think we all have. And I think it would have been, reasonable to consider that maybe they at least some of them struggle with this. The Bible tells us all the Jews in all the kingdom, wherever this edict went to, there was mourning, there was fasting, there was weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Well, we know Haman, at the close of the last chapter, sat with the king to drink while the city of Shushan was perplexed. Where is God? Is he not the defender of the weak and the vulnerable? Does he not hear the plea of the afflicted? Does he not care that his chosen people are slated to be killed? And that's where we come to the next part of the story here. Number 2, Mordecai's request to Esther. Mordecai hears what's going on with her cousin, sitting in this shameful position, and he's outside the king's gate. Now, we know that Mordecai was an official of lower rank among the king's court, but he was not allowed to go into the court while in this position. The Persian court had a very strict etiquette, and you could be put to death for going against that etiquette, and then we'll see that in a moment. I think of in the Nehemiah came before the king and his countenance was sad. And when the Bible tells us when the king saw that Nehemiah's countenance was sad, Nehemiah was very fearful. Why? Because he could be put to death for it. Just for looking bummed out in front of the king. So Mordecai could not even go into the gate of the palace. Esther had to send a servant, his name is Hatak, to go and be the walkie-talkie. He walkie and he talkie. He is the walkie-talkie between Esther and Mordecai, explaining the situation. So as Mordecai gives a request. Go to the king. Make a request to him for your people. Now understand, this is no small task. It's not a little thing to ask. Again, remember that really strict etiquette of the court? This was one of those things, as we read, if you went into the king's court, the inner court, where the king was doing his business, sitting upon his royal throne, meeting with his princes and heads of state and executives, if you went in there and you went in without being invited, it was a sure death sentence unless the king showed mercy to you and extended his golden scepter for you to touch. That is the only way you escaped the hangman's noose. And so for Mordecai to say, hey, Esther, I need you to go talk to the king. Esther, she has a little bit of hesitation for a moment. Hey, Mordecai, just to remind you, if I go in there unannounced, unless the king shows me favor, and remember what happened to the last queen? She got called and didn't show up, and she got banished. If I come without being called, But I think Mordecai helps her to understand that she's in a losing position anyway. She can perish in the inner court, or she can perish at Haman's edict. Either way, she's going to perish. Unless she, does something and gets favor. Unless the king, really all of it is up to whether or not the king is having a good day at the time. And there's a couple truths I want to point out here as we look at Mordecai's request. I know they're going to be very simple, and perhaps you've already heard them, so maybe just repetition is what you need to hear. I think number one, I believe we see that Mordecai had faith in God's promise concerning the Jews. Mordecai had faith in God's promise concerning the Jews. Notice verse 14, the beginning of the verse. Mordecai says to Esther, "For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time." So Esther, if you say nothing, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. Now, Esther, here's the deal. Either you go in or don't. If you don't, God's going to work something else out. He'll take care of us, but he might not take care of you. That's what Mordecai is saying. Because he remembered the promise, the covenant that we've been learning about on Sunday mornings, given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that God had chosen this family to be his people, that he would multiply them as the sand of the sea, he would bless them, and whoever blessed them he would bless, and whoever cursed them he would curse. And in them should all families of the earth be blessed. And Mordecai understood that all families of the earth cannot be blessed if they get wiped out. Messiah cannot come. The promised one, the Ancient of Days that Daniel would have prophesied about almost 100 years before. Mordecai had faith in God's promise. Even in this situation, sometimes we struggle with life and say, where is God in this? We can have this assurance that even when we don't see him working, we know that he is. I was listening to a preaching message recently, and they quoted, I believe it was Spurgeon, who said, when you cannot trace God's hand, you can trust God's heart. You can't trace his hand. You can't see just how he's working out a situation. You can't trace that. You can't see that. There's nothing tangible. You can, in fact, trust the heart of God. I just finished a book called Gentle and Lowly by a pastor named Dane Artland. And in the book, he highlights the heart of God for sinners and sufferers. He looks at Christ's mercy, his grace, and his abundant love, and really drills into what that means for us. And the reality is that Christ will never love us more or less than he already does. He's already quite crazy about us. He went to the cross for us. He died for us. He has abundant grace that we can never outspend. His mercy is renewed day by day. It is more than we could ever hope to pay back. And even in the worst parts, even in our most sinful areas, even when we fall away from God and we fall back into our old lives and fall back into our old habits, that God is never going to take his hand off of us if we are his. This is an incredible promise. And this is what the Jews recognized, that they were God's people. Come what may, through the judges and the kings and the prophets and Babylon and exile and return, they were God's people. And I believe Mordecai understood that. There was faith. There was this confidence that came from that. But then also I see number 2 here, as we look at his charge, his challenge to his cousin here. Mordecai considered the hand of God in the events of his life. So even, sometimes there are times where we cannot trace God's hand. We have to just trust his heart. But sometimes there are times where we can start to see God moving in incredible ways that really just awe us. They're wonderful. They're things that we could never hope or dream for. And he just brings it all together, and it's like, wow, that's how it worked. That's how he did it. I think a personal story I could use is how I met my wife, or started dating my wife. I was, in college and not necessarily the coolest guy on the block. I was the guy that scrubbed the toilets. That was who I was. I was the guy that they got mad at every time some idiot stole all the paper towels and left the rest of the dorm room without. That was my job. And I kept seeing, my friends, they'd start dating, and they seemed like things were going well for them in that department. Brother Rick, I had one event. There was a banquet. I got turned down by 3 different girls, and I only asked one. Yeah, put that together, okay? So yeah, that's how that worked. And then my brother had a date with a girl for a Sadie Hawkins activity, and my wife was friends with this girl, and she invited me to go with them to be that double date. Keep an eye on my brother. And we got to know each other. It was my senior year of college, and it just we'd been friends for years, and it just clicked. And it worked. And I didn't expect it. It wasn't something I was looking for, so to speak, but I knew God had done that. Let me think of other areas. Let's think of our church. Think of debt retirement. Let's talk about that for a moment. We had the banner, debt-free by 2023, and we had the coin jug. How many remember? The coin jug's on the back table still. It's still going strong. We had the coin jug, and Austin and I made a good many trips to the coin machine at the Greater Nevada Credit Union, just dumping them in there to deposit, just trying to pay off that debt. And we were doing offerings, and the poor church cleaners were getting like, Pastor, we're tired of bringing our own vacuums. Can the church please just buy a vacuum? And we're just working. We were focused on that, and God did some big things. Gifts we didn't see coming from, and just one after the other, big things that we just could not anticipate. We started with $89,000 on the mortgage, or $82,000 on the mortgage with I think. Well, no, I'm not doing the math right. $89,000 overall between the mortgage and the van that we'd owed money on, and that was in 2019, and by 2020. End of 2020, right before 2021, we were debt-free. God did that. We didn't see his hand. Believe me, I didn't see it. The year before that, we were trying to renew the mortgage because we knew we had a balloon payment. Talk about, we went through a dozen different people, called, got turned down by a dozen more, just trying to get somebody to renew or to give us a mortgage. Nobody would lend to a church in 2018. At least not a church like ours, an independent, small church. And then we hit that balloon payment, and we're just, man, God, what are you doing? We see it now. Sometimes we can trace God's hand. We see when things just come together and we say, man, mankind could not have done that. God did that. God worked that out. I think of COVID and pretty much all of 2020. And that was a crazy year. And we said, God, what are you doing? But now, looking back and meeting with the leadership of our church and seeing God begin to transform my heart and my wife's heart and our deacons' hearts and the hearts of the people within our church, moving from a very legalistic approach to ministry to a very gospel-centered approach to ministry and desire of people to learn God's word. We saw God working even in the midst of something that was not great. God's hand. And Mordecai sees this. Notice at the end of verse 14, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther, you're a queen. And it may well be that this moment is your moment. God's raised you up and put you in this place and in this time for this purpose. He considered the hand of God in the events of his life. And so we see Mordecai's sorrow. We see Mordecai's response, Mordecai's plea, his request. Let's close our Bible study time with Esther. What does she do? She seeks the right help. Pick up in verse 15. Then Esther bade them, that's the messengers, return to Mordecai this answer. Okay, here's what I want you to tell Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan. Get the whole Jewish community, every one of our people that are in the city, and fast ye for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days. Everyone, 3-day fast. You know what else they're doing besides fasting? They're praying. What is fasting? Fasting is an affliction of the soul by putting off, self-control in the area of feeding our flesh, or putting off something. Or maybe fasting from food, as is typically the case, or maybe sometimes people fast from technology or fast from social media or whatever. But we're putting off something that we would indulge in. We're putting off something we would enjoy to humble ourselves, to afflict our souls, to draw us and drive us closer to God. To bring us to God's footsteps and bring us really to where God sits on his throne and say, God, we need you desperately, and we're willing to put off something that our bodies need to show you just how much we recognize our need for you. It's humility. It's casting all our care upon him, for he cared for us. She proclaims a fast. Everyone, 3 days, night and day. No food, no drink. And I and my maidens will fast likewise. So will I go into the king, which is not according to the law. I will break the law after these 3 days. And if I perish, I perish.